Some movies don't get the recognition they deserve when they first come out. Take The Thing, for example. Upon its release in 1982, it was a critical and box office failure. Yet today, it's hailed as a masterpiece of sci-fi horror. Krull, released just a year later in 1983, faced a similar fate. Panned by critics and dismissed by audiences at the time, it has since faded into relative obscurity. But much like The Thing, Krull is a film that, in retrospect, deserves far more credit than it got. When Krull hit theatres, it struggled to find an audience. Critics were particularly harsh, accusing the film of being derivative, a strange hybrid of Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings. Its blend of sci-fi and fantasy was seen as a confusing mishmash, and the film's box office performance was underwhelming. In an era dominated by massive blockbusters like Return of the Jedi, Krull was viewed as just another expensive flop. Yet what many critics missed at the time was that Krull was trying to do something unique. Yes, it draws from familiar genres, but it adopts the best elements of the fantasy and sci-fi films that inspired it. The film borrows from the epic scope of The Lord of the Rings, the swashbuckling adventure of Star Wars, and even the darker, more introspective tones of films like The Thing. Far from being simply derivative, Krull is a synthesis of the genres, pulling from their strengths to create something new and exciting. Looking back on Krull today, it's clear the film has much more to offer than it was given credit for in 1983. For starters, the world building in Krull is truly impressive. The film takes us to a beautifully crafted fantasy world filled with diverse landscapes, from sprawling deserts to ominous swamps to ancient castles. The cinematography is stunning, capturing the epic scale of this fictional universe. Each location feels rich with history and magic, providing a visual spectacle that still holds up. And then let's talk about the score. James Horner's sweeping orchestral soundtrack elevates this film to another level. Next to Conan the Barbarian, which is still my favourite, it stands as one of the most exciting and powerful fantasy soundtracks of the 80s. Horner, known for his later work on Titanic and Braveheart, created a score that amplifies the sense of adventure, danger, and grandeur throughout the film. He also did the score for Alien, let's not forget, and it's a vital part of what makes Krull so engaging. It pulls the audience into this vast, otherworldly quest. I still play this soundtrack today, and it's got one of the most exciting and magical scores that I can remember. One aspect of Krull that often goes overlooked is its remarkable cast. The film is filled with now recognisable faces who went on to have long and successful careers. Liam Neeson, in an early role, plays one of Colwyn's rogues, providing a glimpse of the gravitas he would bring to roles in Schindler's List and Taken. Robbie Coltrane, famous for his portrayal of Hagrid in the Harry Potter films, also appears as a member of Colwyn's band of warriors. There's the ever-reliable Alan Armstrong, who brings depth and charisma, and Bernard Bresslaw, a towering presence as the solemn and tragic Cyclops Rel. And then there's Francesca Annis, who plays the Widow of the Web, a character integral to one of the film's most memorable sequences. The scene in the giant spider's lair is hauntingly dark and tense, adding to the film's more frightening elements. The way the widow's tragic past is woven into the scene with the giant spiders both terrifying and emotionally resonant. It's a moment that shows Krull can balance high fantasy with deeply emotional storytelling. One thing people often forget is just how dark and frightening Krull can be, especially for a fantasy film from the 80s, and its target audience. The film's villain, the Beast, is a genuinely terrifying presence. His shape-shifting black fortress is a nightmarish labyrinth that feels more like something from a horror movie than a traditional fantasy setting. And the Slayers, his minions, are terrifying in their own right. Armed with futuristic weapons, their design is menacing, especially when their heads explode upon death, releasing parasitic creatures and a god-awful noise which used to really get to me as a kid. Compared to other contemporary fantasy films, Krull leans heavily into the darker themes. The idea of an unstoppable force from another world taking over and destroying everything in its path feels grim and hopeless at times. It's a film that doesn't shy away from the cost of heroism. Colwyn loses allies along the way, the stakes feel real, and the dark tone gives Krull a certain weight that sets it apart from other, more light-hearted fantasy films of the era. For all its genre-blending ambition, Krull also excels when it comes to practical effects. The film's practical effects work is impressive, especially for its time. The Cyclops Rel is brought to life with convincing prosthetics and makeup, while the set design, from the Black Fortress to the interiors of castles and caves, is richly detailed. These elements, paired with the film's wide-ranging and exotic locations, create a world that feels lived in and immersive. The same goes for the visual effects during the film's most intense scenes, like the attack on the Black Fortress or the deadly spider sequence. While some effects may look dated by today's standards, they hold a charm and craftsmanship that's missing in many modern CGI-heavy films. It's important to mention that Krull was not a low-budget affair. In fact, his budget was comparable to some of the biggest blockbusters of the time, costing an estimated $30 million, which is a huge amount for 1983. The high production value is evident in nearly every frame, from the elaborate sets to the creature designs. Krull used every cent of its budget to create something that looked epic. But much like The Thing, which also boasted impressive effects, it wasn't appreciated on release, possibly due to audiences not fully grasping the scope of what the filmmakers were trying to achieve. At the heart of Krull is the love story between Prince Colwyn, played by Ken Marshall, and Princess Lissa, played by Lissa Anthony, which gives the film its emotional centre. While the hero's journey is a familiar trope in fantasy, Colwyn's quest to save Lissa feels deeply personal. Their relationship is introduced with an arranged marriage that's meant to unite kingdoms, but it becomes something more as we see Colwyn's unwavering determination to rescue her from the beast. Lissa is more than just a damsel in distress. Her connection to Colwyn drives much of the film's emotional tension, particularly as she navigates the dark, surreal environment of the Black Fortress. Her scenes with the beast, as she resists his attempts to seduce her, highlight the strength and resolve. In many ways, their love story becomes the emotional anchor of the film, grounding the fantasy and sci-fi elements into something more human. One of the most memorable and culturally impactful elements of Krull is the Glaive, a mystical weapon that's become a symbol of the film and an iconic part of 80s fantasy cinema. The Glaive is a 5-pointed, star-shaped blade that Prince Colwyn must seek out to defeat the beast. It's not just a weapon, it's a legendary artifact with immense power, and it plays a central role in the movie's narrative. The Glaive is introduced as something of a mythical object, hidden in a cave and trapped within molten lava. Colwyn must first retrieve it in an almost ceremonial fashion, symbolising his readiness to take on his destiny. But it's not just handed to him. Throughout much of the film, the Glaive is kept in reserve, heightening its mystique and importance as something that will be needed in the final confrontation with the beast. When Colwyn finally unleashes the Glaive in battle, its impact is awe-inspiring. He controls it telekinetically, guiding its sharp, spinning blades with precision. The weapon becomes an extension of Colwyn's will, representing not only his power but also the unity of purpose between him and Lissa, as it is the symbol of their marriage and combined strength. The Glaive's destructive force and unique design make it one of the film's most visually striking elements, ensuring its place in the pantheon of iconic fantasy weapons. In many ways, the Glaive is the heart of Krull's identity. It's a symbol of the film's genre-blending approach, mixing traditional fantasy lore with a hint of sci-fi weaponry, make it a standout element that fans of the film and the genre still remember fondly today. Though Krull may not have achieved blockbuster status, the Glaive remains a touchstone for fantasy fans, a reminder of the bold creativity that shaped the movie. This is where I think Krull shares a kinship with The Thing. Both films were released in the early 80s and were rejected by audiences and critics at first. The Thing was criticised for being too dark, too gruesome, and too pessimistic in the era of E.T. and family-friendly sci-fi. But over time, people began to realise the brilliance of John Carpenter's direction, the practical effects, and the atmosphere of paranoia that made The Thing so effective. In the same way, Krull was judged too quickly for being an odd genre hybrid, when in fact its ambition and creativity should have been celebrated. Just like The Thing, which was ahead of its time in terms of its nihilistic tone and groundbreaking effects, Krull was pioneering its own way. It dared to blend science fiction with the high fantasy genre, something we see more commonly today in franchises like Star Wars or Guardians of the Galaxy. In 1983, this fusion wasn't appreciated, but today we can see it was innovative and far more complex than critics gave it credit for. Much like The Thing found a second life on home video and is now regarded as a classic of the genre, Krull has potential to be re-evaluated by modern audiences. So if you've never seen Krull, or if you wrote it off based on the initial reception, I encourage you to give it another chance. Like The Thing, it may surprise you just how much it has to offer decades later. After all, sometimes it takes time for a movie's brilliance to be fully appreciated. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think about Krull. Is it an underrated gem, or do you think the critics got it right? And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more in-depth movie discussions. I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.